All right, this is the second part of the Monday lecture. It's only 6 slides long, so we'll zing through that and then we can field any questions and move on to sources. There we are. So after the Mycenaeans and the Minoans and the Cyclades people had had their run, and you notice that they all stopped about 1100 BC. And in a shockingly short period of time, everything kind of just falls off a cliff. And you can see this actually in the mythology because you follow the lineage of the great heroes, right? You had Pelops, and that generation, and then you have Atreus, and then you have Agamemnon and Menelaus, and then they have children, and then nothing. Like, those children, first of all, don't do anything very interesting except exist as the children of Achilles. No, Achilles has not died. Odysseus, Agamemnon, Menelaus, all the great heroes had kids who just were names. They did no great accomplishments, and they didn't seem to have children of their own. And that's because basically the whole culture just kind of comes to a very abrupt end. We don't know why the Mycenaean culture suddenly stopped. There's all kinds of theories. Was it war? Was it seismic? Seismic stuff certainly did happen earlier. Was it just bad harvests? Was it an invasion of the Dorians? Plague is often one, sounds like a weird thing. Plague often is one that crops up in people's minds, more so in the last 2 or 3 years than before. But plague certainly occurred in the ancient world. Whatever happened, it happened relatively quickly and quite traumatically. We get to a period that's called the Dark Ages, and it's very judgmental. It's sort of like, oh yeah, society was not nearly as good as it had been in the old days. The first people who described it that way were the ancients themselves. They themselves thought, oh yeah, society went downhill. And they even had kind of a cultural idea that society in general gets worse as time goes on. The Mycenaean period, they actually looked upon as an outlier blip up. And then it went down again. One thing that did happen for sure is that there was massive depopulation. There just were not the same numbers of people living in Crete, living on the Cyclades Islands, living in the Greek mainland. Way fewer. We don't have demographic stats on it, so people will just bandy around numbers like it dropped by 60%, it dropped by 80%. But it was very abrupt, and it was large scale because you did not have big communities anymore. Archaeological remains, when they find them, tend to be very small little communities. There also seems to have been actually some migration out of the Greek mainland. That's harder to track. What did happen was the Dorians, which is kind of the last significant immigration of peoples into the Greek area, until you get, the Huns and the Goths and the Visigoths coming in around 350 AD or CE and beyond. What's an interesting thing to note here is that the Dorians over time became referred to as the Heraclidae. They actually identified themselves as the descendants of Heracles, who had been turfed out of Greece and were now sort of like coming and taking their rightful place as the controlling force in the Greek world. Um, it's interesting because, to me, if you think about this, the Dorians coming in doing that are totally buying into the culture that they are coming across, right? The Dorians are coming in and they totally have a total buy-in to the native Greek culture. And rather than completely imposing themselves and saying, well, no, this is the culture that you guys are going to have, it's like, we're going to try to fit into that. So like, we're actually the generation before you guys. Now, it wasn't all bad. You still had farmers out there plowing the fields, picking olives. You still had pottery being made. Life went on, and for a lot, I can imagine for a number of people, it wasn't a catastrophic, like, oh my God, this is terrible. We need to have a Make Greece Great Again party. It's just that there were a lot fewer people doing the things that were going on, so there was less support for big infrastructure, like walled cities and invading armies. And yeah, see, like I say, the Dorians are not the new kids on the block. They're just somebody who's moving back to the hood. All right. It's the top half of the civilization that's gone. The massive palaces, the kings. That's the bit that is completely gone. I'm not trying to be judgmental, but the bottom half is the part that is still plugging away, doing its thing. Potters, weavers, this is it. We still get pottery made, right? They're still putting oil and wine into vessels to store it and drink it or use it. I don't think they drank too much olive oil. And there is actually some advances that happen in the Dark Ages. It's not like everything is bad. One of the things they could do is they could create hotter fires. So as a matter of fact, the quality of the pottery went up, even if the designs are more basic. The overall quality of the clayware went up. And they now have the ability to make iron, because it takes a hotter fire to work iron than it does to work bronze. And so you get things like this. It's very simple, but they have got the circles there are made, let's say artificially, but they are not done freehand. In the Mycenaean period, when civilization was wonderful and unbelievable, they had to do those by freehand. Now they've actually taken a compass to draw an absolutely perfect circle. So there is some discoveries, put it that way. They can do things that people before couldn't do. You notice, by the way, that there is a universality to the shape of the pottery. It's very much the same. Part of it is a utilitarian thing. It works well, but it also suggests a continuity there. It's not like potters completely forgot how to make pots and then had to start from scratch, because at that point you would expect there to be, oh, they came up with something different. So no, it suggests that they're plugging away. They never forgot how to do the work.
I was just wondering why on all, even like drinking cups, all the handles are upward facing instead of sideways. That's probably.
Oh, I see what you mean. Yes, they're like this rather than this. There are some that are like this that you would those are actually drinking. Those are drinking cups, like goblets, things like that would be like this. These are big. They're not. So it's probably a matter of it's for carrying purposes. So yeah, drinking is more likely to be shaped like that. Carrying is like that. And if you're only listening to this, you just have to picture what we just said. Anyway, so technology did go along, and in some cases adapted to the new circumstances. And I have to mention this because people often like to complain about how, oh, people nowadays, they don't know how to use dial phones and they don't know how to do this. And it's because it's not a skill that has any value anymore, but there are new skills that people have. So one skill that they stopped developing and teaching and learning was the use of chariots, because they had no purpose whatsoever in battle. So, people in 900 BC were not adept at using chariots, but that's because that was a useless skill to have. If they did have cavalry at all involved in a battle, it was just riding on horseback. They didn't use chariots. And you see that, it's quite funny if you read Homer really analytically. Is it an advantage to fight standing with your opponent or fight them from a chariot?
Generally in a chariot.
Yeah, you would think so, right? You've got speed, you've got gravity helping you plunge downwards, and yet in Homer's Iliad, the hero rushes into battle on his chariot, and then when he goes to fight, immediately gets off. Every time. No hero in the Iliad ever fights from their chariot. It's just a cab to get you to work, and that's it. Right? And it's because as they were telling the stories over the generations, having chariot fighting and describing that to the listeners couldn't relate to it anymore. It was meaningless. So they had to describe battles in the way that the people who were listening to them fought battles themselves. But they still had to keep the chariots in there because it was significantly integral to the story that taking them out would have weirded the story out. Anyway, so that's the kind of thing. It is evolving. They're picking up new skills. They're dropping irrelevant skills. Another thing was they made better shields. In the Iliad, Ajax's shield is made out of oxhide, and it's like his companions can barely lift it. It's like 7. And you think of us like, yeah, but compared to like metal, that seems lame. It doesn't seem like a very, it's like time for the upgrade. But that was the standard in Mycenaean times. By the time you get to the Dark Ages, they figured out making wooden shields with metal covers, which are a little bit more effective. All right, that is that. The next thing we're going to talk about will be, in terms of content, is going to be about this, spreading colonies out. And you can see they spread out quite wide.